like defining what project someone's going to work on in the first 6 months.
Yeah.
Using that to then distill down what are the skills and capabilities someone needs.
Yeah.
We then define who are the people on our team who need to help vet those things and how will they do that. And we have a full kickoff meeting with those folks to kind of rumble on the position.
Hiring is one of the most important roles of a manager, but we often skip over what it takes to be a good hiring manager. How do you find the right people to bring into your team or organization? Luckily, our guest today has a lot of experience doing just that. Jesse Klekamp is a recruiting and people leader at K2 Space. We've known each other for years. We first met when we were both working at SpaceX up in Vandenberg on the central coast of California, and she spent a lot of time hiring some of the most amazing people in the world to do some of the most amazing things in the world. And so in our conversation today, we touch a little bit on the most interesting roles that Jesse has ever hired for, along with the things that she thinks makes a difference between a good hiring manager and a bad hiring manager. What are the things that a good hiring manager is going to bring to the table? And how can the hiring manager and the recruiter work together to make sure they find the best hire? If this is your first time listening to the Leadership Launchpad, make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss a future episode. And if you're already subscribed, I would humbly ask that you take just a moment to share this show with one other person. After all, that is how we grow. And I simply can't tell you how much it means to me. And with that, let's get into the discussion with Jesse Klekamp. So you've been recruiting for 12 years-ish.
Yeah, if we're counting.
All in space?
No, the first couple of years were more software recruiting for an enterprise company.
Okay, so you've been recruiting in space for a while. What's the most interesting role you've recruited for?
Ooh, to be honest, they all are pretty interesting.
I'm sure.
That's part of the fun of recruiting
Yeah.
is like pivoting from thing to thing. But we always joke that if I had an autobiography, it would be from farmers to flight surgeons.
I love it. Yeah, because especially at SpaceX, the very wide ranging.
Yeah. So I think the most fun that I've had was working on kind of the space medicine team.
Okay.
As SpaceX started to fly humans, there's obviously a lot of the human system that has to be taken care of in those missions.
Yep.
And so growing the space medicine team was a really unique blend of things, but also something to be really thoughtful about that we were employing in the right way. So it really stretched kind of what I was responsible for and how we made sure that we were taking care of the people in the loop and the company at the same time.
That made me think, kind of talking about this idea of like this wide range of kind of roles. How do you as a recruiter like get started in, moving from one role to the other? You're hiring, the people who are doing the hiring or maybe doing it for the first time. You're talking to people for the first time. How do you get started of even learning like what good looks like when you're recruiting for a new role?
Yeah, it's such a partnership, like for sure. I think the best recruiters definitely spend their own time researching and trying to like build that mental model.
Yeah.
But a lot of it is truly like the partnership with the engineer or like the stakeholder that you're helping to support.
Yeah.
And some of it is just well-honed intuition over a long stretch of time.
I'm sure.
Then I think my grasp on what makes someone excellent on a different role is very different today than it was 10 years ago. That's hopefully true of all of us.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think never underestimate YouTube videos to just like start getting the kind of jargon down and in your head to be able to poke on questions or start to understand what second or third order effects are from some of the things people are talking about.
Yeah.
But it's really starting to really partner with whoever you're hiring for and better understand what the differentiators are.
That makes a lot of sense. So you and I, we first met at SpaceX, right? We worked together. We were up at Vandenberg and then kind of both made it down to the LA area. But now we've both moved on. Now you're at K2 Space, which a lot of people listening maybe may or may not have heard of.
Not yet.
Tell me a little bit. Yeah, I know. Doing big things, literally.
Literally.
In space.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's K2 about?
Yeah, I love our tagline is broad for a reason, but it's really like making previously impossible missions possible.
Love it.
And I think the big dream came from Neil Kunjer, one of our co-founders, and his brother, our CEO, Karan. We're looking at the decadal studies for NASA, like kind of like what NASA scientists are wanting to go and look at over the next decade. And really realizing that like the feasibility of a lot of those things is still deeply impacted by the cost of technology today.
Okay.
That you really couldn't do them. And so what we're trying to do is redevelop technology that empowers those big, bold missions to happen. The way we're approaching it, like that is different from the market, and the big bet or thesis we have is that the advent of far richer launch capability has actually exonerated mass as like the biggest design factor. The cost per kilogram, right, has been one of the biggest markers of something. And so taking advantage of the new capabilities in Lift, we're actually looking at how do you build massive systems. So the mega class satellite, the giga class satellite eventually, that are going to allow us to do multiple orbital regimes or like have flexibility across orbital regimes. So we can do LEO, high LEO, like a lot of the small sats do, with far more power and performance. We can also go to MEO, GEO, cislunar, and beyond. So I think the things that we're deeply passionate about are certainly like longer range in dream and scope. I joke with Karan that he's passionate about the icy moons of Jupiter. I told him I want to prioritize the Saturn rings, and he was like, we don't have to choose. But I think that's the awesome thing. It's like our dream is that there's a probe around every body in the solar system, that there's a deep space communication network. And those things require far more capable space vehicles. So our big bet is low cost, high power, high capability.
I love it. Yeah. It's funny. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was at a talent development conference talking about first principles leadership. And the metaphor that I used through it, or one of the metaphors that I used, was going to the moon. And we kind of start talking about how there are a couple different proposals for how to go to the moon. Like, do you do direct descent, or do you do lunar orbit rendezvous, which we eventually ended up doing? And everybody thought direct descent was how they were going to do it because it was the simplest. Because it's just you build a giant rocket, go there, come back. Couldn't be simpler. And the reason lunar orbit rendezvous won is because the problem of getting to the moon, the problem of everything in space so far, is really mass. It's not complexity of mission. It's all about mass. And so when it's all about mass, that's where you bring in tons of these power requirements, just everything.
Exotic materials.
Everything has to be just within the last percentage of what's possible. And that's I'm so excited about what K2 Space is. It's just like, what if we changed that? What if we said this wasn't the primary concern, which is a big, bold bet, which seemed, at least if anybody watching the media have seen the clips of SpaceX coming back, obviously it's a bet that is hopefully going to pay off, or it seems like it's paying off.
And it's been exciting. Like, there certainly is like that long-term dream that we're thinking about, but there's also like the immediacy of constellations today that we're seeing like true interest from our commercial partners, our national security partners, that I think those long-term deep space missions are deeply important, but there's also critical things today that can leverage existing technologies, don't even require a Starship of the future.
Awesome. Well, the primary reason we could both talk about space forever, for a long time. The primary reason I wanted to have you on, though, is because obviously, we start off the conversation. You've been recruiting for a long time. You've worked with a lot of stakeholders. You've worked with a lot of hiring managers. And I really wanted to think through, like, for the managers listening, get your perspective, get the recruiter's perspective of what makes a good hiring manager, what makes a good hiring process. So I kind of love to start there, in your experience, like with that kind of broad question of like, what do you think makes a good hiring manager?
I think it almost has to circle back to, instead of it being like your role versus the partnership. And I think that's the true definition for me, is that recruiting is ultimately a relationship and a partnership between the recruiter and the hiring manager. And so I think one of the biggest flaws I've seen in hiring managers is when they view it as a pure service relationship of like, I put in a service order, this is what I want from you, deliver it several months from now, versus it's often a co-creation experience of like really honing in, and almost more of a scientific process of, this is what we've tried. What are the signals or lack of signals that we're getting back from the process, and how are we tweaking over time? So I think the best hiring managers are someone who view their recruiting partners as true partners, who then balance, like, what can I uniquely bring to the table as potentially the more technical expert, the person who is like deep in the weeds of the problems I'm trying to solve, and where do I actually solicit and lean on the expertise of my recruiting partner, of process changes we can use, technology that's out there that we can leverage, like their read on how this compares to other people across the market.
Yeah.
Like I've probably talked to more engineers than the average person has. Not all of them have been great, but I probably have a more calibrated percentage ranking than you might right away of like this passes a sniff test or not.
Yeah.
Unconscious bias. Like there's so many things that we can kind of help together see our flaws in both of our perspectives if we're working together.
Interesting. So it's all about developing that relationship and that deep respect from. I'm sure there's lots of things you do as a recruiter to try to foster that relationship. I don't know.
Yeah.
Is there anything in particular you would hope for a new, maybe it's somebody's hiring for the first time.
Yeah.
I don't know, what would you ideally want them to be coming to you with to start that relationship?
Yeah. I think ultimately it's also the question of like, how early do you come to someone?
Yeah.
And I think that's honestly like one of the best things I think that a recruiter can help with is like, hey, I think I want to grow my team. And like, here's why I think, or like what signals I'm getting. Sometimes even getting the signal that like, man, I think this is the next year of hiring for me.
Yeah.
We might know like, man, finding an RF engineer is going to take longer potentially than another discipline. So we want to kickstart the process sooner.
Yeah.
So I think having almost a year-long perspective, or like, it doesn't have to be well-baked, but like an inclination of where you're going can be really helpful and can change how you relate. From there, I think both parties being open and honest about what they do and don't know.
Yeah.
I'll never forget one of my direct reports. She was really stressed about her first time hiring at a new company and like got all the way to the end. And the hiring manager that she was working with asked, so how did I do? And she's like, well, what do you mean? And he said, this was my first time hiring.
Oh, wow.
And she was like, oh, this fundamentally shifts how I would have been interacting with you.
Interesting.
If I knew that all of these were first time for you.
She assumed she had an assumption of like, oh, this is how you do things, or you're asking this for a reason. Interesting.
And so I think that's something that I have absolutely learned from, even like every single kickoff of like having an initial conversation with someone's like, hey, how much hiring have you done before? Like, how confident do you feel in hiring? And just getting a baseline together there. I always am honest of like, hey, it's been a couple years since I've recruited for that profile. What has changed in the industry around these technologies for you? But I think starting there with almost all cards on the table of like, here's our headspace, here's where we're going together, and then working from there.
Well, I'm sure even if a manager has done it before, not every company is growing leaps and bounds and hiring tons of people. So there's plenty of hiring managers that maybe, for most hiring managers at most companies, probably maybe they hire once a year. It's been a couple of years since they've been through this. And so there's probably a little bit of baselining that would need to happen every time almost. Yeah.
And I've also I think about some of your podcasts too, of like people are ill-equipped as a new people manager sometimes. I've often found that companies, one of the first tasks people give an aspiring hiring manager or aspiring manager is to be involved in recruiting.
Sure.
And so it's an interesting one. Like I see, not that it's like training wheels, but it's a place where they can get repetition and build their perspective on the team.
Yeah.
And so even more so, I find that like there's a lot of new folks being added to the mix. They're actively calibrating while they're learning.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, especially even if you're an aspiring manager or something, because the whole interview process does give you it exposes you to the decision-making process of other people, gives you a little bit of a higher level view of, oh, this is the direction for the team. This is what the team values. The manager, your manager, is clearly going to be saying what they value because they're going to choose to hire somebody. I never thought about that before. That's a really interesting kind of potential development pathway.
Yeah. I wonder if it's different between companies, but it certainly has been consistent in my experience like it's one of the things that you at least bring newer folks who are aspiring in on early, whether they're shadowing or just being a part of it or kind of thrown into the deep end to start trying to execute on their own in it.
What are some other things you're looking for? Because, you kind of mentioned that they're obviously bringing that like technical expertise and some of that. Are there any other things? Sometimes I hear a bit of, where should we be looking for these candidates, or what can you do to help with the recruiting process? How much do you look for managers to do that as well, of kind of like almost like sourcing candidates?
It's a really helpful part of the puzzle. I think almost before you get there, it's like really refining what the job is together.
Sure.
I think you and I talked, one of the things I love about Neil Kunjer, the CTO that I work with now, is that he holds a really high bar for our team on what we even have understood about a role before we even start looking. And so for us, that looks like certainly like defining what project someone's going to work on in the first 6 months. Using that to then distill down what are the skills and capabilities someone needs. We then define who are the people on our team who need to help vet those things and how will they do that. And we have a full kickoff meeting with those folks to kind of rumble on the position of like, does this background look like what we would need to do those projects?
Yeah.
All of those people are then free sourcing almost. Like if they're all calibrated to know what we're looking for, we actually ask them to leverage their networks of like, where would you see this excellent talent? Like keep your eye out on the news for like where things are changing or flexing that could help us, and going from there.
Yeah.
So certainly I think it's kind of an all play of all the folks who are helping with recruiting, or even at your company. I think recruiting is a team sport through and through.
Yeah.
But then from there, the hiring manager, sometimes it's as granular as like tweaking keywords of technologies that are related.
Oh,
like, ooh, like we want this, but in industry, a predecessor would have been this technology, or this is a new thing that might be in the mix.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's keywords, it's schools, programs, news.
Yeah.
So
how do you kind of push that process? Kind of that idea of, you mentioned free sourcing and thinking.
Yeah.
How do you get people thinking maybe in more creative ways of where to source people? Because I think most of us, the human brain is designed to, think through analogy. We see what made us successful. I went to this school and I'm successful, so let's look at people from my school. And you mentioned, sometimes it's tweaking technology terms, or how do you get people thinking a little more broadly?
It's what I'm always trying to play with. I think because I'd love to find ways to do it more asynchronously because time is so precious.
Yep.
It's like I'd love to send someone away with homework and have them get back to me. But I think that like the true reality is like sitting down with someone. I found the most success in either partner sourcing of like actually showing someone the Boolean logic that I'm using and how I'm playing with it to find different
like how it's adjusting the candidate pool based on what you put in there. That's
like, ooh, like this is what we're seeing. Like, is that on or off? Like, what could we add that slightly tweaks that?
Yeah.
So kind of doing that together and seeing where their brains are going as kind of free association. But even before that, I think about sourcing often in terms of like overlapping Venn diagrams.
Sure.
And almost playing with that of like, man, from an operations perspective, what are all the operations roles?
Yeah.
And you might start with a couple that all of a sudden get weeded out into like not quite the territory.
Yeah.
But doing that free association before you're even looking at candidate profiles, but playing with kind of where talent could come from, I find has helped me to be far more strategic versus a non-strategic recruiter is just going to like grab keywords from the job description that you put, plug and chug into LinkedIn and just scan through resumes. And there's some value in that and like building some awareness of what's out there. But man, let the computer do that and like bring a far more strategic perspective to how you're crafting your search.
Yeah. I mean, there was a podcast, I think the Ezra Klein podcast I was listening to recently, and they were talking about government hiring.
Yep.
And they're saying that basically like that is all government hiring right now, is that the first pass is just, do you have the exact keywords that were written into it? And there's all kinds of, any number of people on LinkedIn or elsewhere will tell people looking for a job that's one of the keys that they need to do is like, how do you craft it? But I liked in this particular conversation, this person was talking about how, so basically the first screen is how much can someone like creatively tailor their resume? And is that a skill that we really need to be screening for?
Yeah, it's an annoying one of like, do I actually believe that it's giving us the highest level signal on the candidate we're looking for? I think an active conversation I'm always in is an excellent interviewer does not necessarily, like interviewee is not necessarily the direct corollary to an excellent employee.
Yeah.
And so it's our responsibility and job to design the interview process to try to remove some of the stages that we can. But things like a resume and a cover letter are things that I haven't yet found alternatives to that are still compliant, right? There still are a lot of compliance things that we want to honor and find ways in.
Yeah.
But are there alternatives that better represent what someone brings to the table for this specific skill set?
Yeah. Well, on that note then, kind of where at the early stages of looking, there, you're looking at a resume, cover letter, like what are the kinds of things that you or that managers should be looking for when you're at that stage, when you're reviewing, what have you found effective?
Yeah, I think it's one of the places that the most unconscious bias comes.
Absolutely.
So, like, I hesitate from saying like this is exactly the thing.
No,
and so much of it is truly understanding your organization and what kind of those knockout criteria are.
Okay.
I remember someone in my past saying like so many people approach a resume with the lens of why not? Like if you're washing out people as opposed to washing people in.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that really compelling for myself
Yeah.
of like just a mental shift, I think has made me move from kind of that Ezra Klein model of like just looking for certain keywords
Yep.
versus looking for signal that someone could overperform.
Yeah.
And is that more time intensive? Yes. Like, do you still need to do your due diligence to do compliant recruiting to make
Mm-hmm.
sure that like
Mm-hmm.
the basic requirements are fulfilled? Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But I think shifting the perspective to like, how can I understand someone's ceiling
Hmm.
from their resume
Hmm.
as opposed to their current experience is just an interesting pivot for us often.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a marker of what stage K2 is in and what we're looking for as a company.
Sure.
But I think we really want to empower engineers to be autonomous, the idea of kind of radical ownership that is permeated across aerospace.
Yeah.
But the idea of like someone should be aspiring to far more,
Yeah.
but have the capabilities to do what they have today.
Yeah.
So from that realm, like you're looking at someone who's often like taking steps outside of their core work. Sometimes that even is as minimal as like personal projects. Is someone actively engaged in this area, or is it just a daytime sort of occupation?
Yeah.
How have they worked to actualize their knowledge? Like, is it hands-on? Are they testing and like resilient?
Yeah.
But those are some of the things that resumes don't capture today.
It's
is
really hard.
Resilience, grit, intellectual curiosity.
Yep.
So we're trying to look for how those intangibles become more tangible.
Yeah, it's funny. I just finished reading like Eric Berger's book series of Liftoff and Reentry about the early stages of SpaceX, and
we lived it.
Yeah, and whether you're reading that or Ashley Vance's book When the Heavens Went on Sale and everything, it's amazing how much of especially like really early stage recruiting is just like going to the Rocket Club and like driving out to Mojave and seeing who's hanging out is interesting because there are those challenges, those intangibles that don't always come across in a resume.
Yeah.
What about the rest of kind of like the hiring process? What are some of the other key stages that you see that make a hiring successful?
Yeah. I feel like I'm repeating it a little bit, but I think some of it is really defining it to the role.
Yeah.
And so I think, again, one of the concepts we think about is like, what signals do we need throughout the interview process?
Yeah.
Like, what are the actual traits? How would we see those manifest?
Yeah.
And now how do we actually define the interview process to capture those things?
Mm-hmm.
And so it changes based on roles.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of the space companies have adopted the same model of a presentation to a group of folks on a project.
Yep.
And for some disciplines, I think that's really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
For others, like, is it actually capturing the signals you're looking for and why? Is there a more elegant way to do that?
And is it maybe filtering out great people? Are they going to need to present in their role? And if not, like maybe you're going to weed them out because they don't have good presentation skills when you don't need that skill.
Absolutely. I think that changes for a company over time too. Like your risk posture almost of who's making it through stages might shift based on your available time and like how much growth you need to do in a short period of time.
Yeah.
So I think all of it is kind of an iterative process. I think about better every day. It's like, how are we constantly tweaking our interview process to have better signal or optimizing for what we need today?
Yeah.
If we're optimizing for like, man, we really want to find really different viewpoints than what we have today, that probably is going to look like taking more chances. And so you're going to redesign some broader signals that you're looking for.
Yep.
But if you really need like, hey, this person needs to be on our team within the next 2 months and we don't have a ton of engineering time, you're going to be far tighter on what the definition of success is.
Yeah.
Potentially, like we talked about, like washing out high potential, but it's that constant trade of kind of what you can invest versus what can the process actually vector through.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. We do just keep kind of coming back to this idea of just like it's in the beginning, it's like that old adage of if I have an hour to chop down a tree, I'm going to spend 50 minutes sharpening my axe kind of thing. I also think, in the video production realm, I've listened a lot to, Mr. Beast, really big YouTuber. And he always talks about how even he underemphasizes the, first 3 seconds and the thumbnail. Like it's all about like having that it's all about the beginning. The beginning is really important. And so when I do some interview training as well, I've done it for a few different organizations, and it's amazing how much of it comes back to like, if you can get the job rec right, if you can spend the time to really tightly define the definitions, everything else becomes easier. It keeps you out of legal troubles. It tells you what you can and can't ask, because ultimately everybody's trying to come up with creative questions to ask to really get at the heart of an individual. It's like, look, just ask them, tell me about a time you did this thing that's required on the job description. And that's not it's not horrible.
It's not horrible. Yeah.
It's at least not illegal.
Yeah, it's true. It's at least compliant. But yeah, I had the conversation today. Someone was like, so can we get the job description up today? I was like, you don't know what you want this person to do yet. Like, yes, I can put it up, but is it a practice in just like wasted time almost?
Yeah.
Like, I think we're fast to feel like that's creating results, or at least it's like pulling in potential, but it might not be pulling in the right potential.
Yeah.
And where are we already setting a precedent as a company about how we're setting expectations, how we're fulfilling our relationship to a candidate, of like what we're looking for, how we're defining that. So yeah, I think I never want to be the brakes on the process, but I also agree, like a ton of intention ahead of a job posting is actually going to yield better results in the long term for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Once you do get into the interview process, we briefly touched on questions there. Like, where do you, I feel like there's a spectrum of, very, probably like the one end of the spectrum is, I'm going to look at your resume. Tell me about this thing that you did, all the way to the like really creative, esoteric questions that aren't, like, what animal do you think you would be or something like, I don't know. Where do you find the right place to be in that range of how direct versus, creative to be with questions?
Yeah. Again, it's sometimes the signals you're looking for. Like, it's some of the culture that you might have as a company. I don't find value in like the random trivia sorts of things, but you might be looking for someone's mental agility and like their willingness to like not take themselves so seriously.
Yeah.
And so there's a time and a place for some of these questions. I don't know that like what animal would you be, or like I think about the movie The Internship. No, maybe where they like if you were shrunk down to the size of a penny and stuck in a blender. I don't know.
Yeah.
But there are some that like give you signals into like what someone values and how they approach really unique problems.
Yeah.
But I think if you do ask those, I think almost giving the context to them of like, this is what I'm aiming and asking you this question. I think we find it far more valuable to typically talk about the role and then almost directly say the traits that we find really valuable in this role are these things: intellectual curiosity, grit, resilience, and then digging into those questions. And yes, you could argue like you're giving away the answer of what you're looking for, but if you're actually interviewing and following the conversational path versus checking boxes, I think you can actually start to suss out where that's real signal versus artifice or like performance.
Just performing to the answers. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think, to summarize everything you said, I would almost say like, you just need to have a point to every question. You have to know why you're asking every single question. And if you're not giving the answers, as you say, then you're kind of, one of the traits you're screening for is, can they figure out the answers? Can they figure out what we're looking for? And maybe that's important, but often it's not. And so does it hurt to show your hand and then really get into the conversation?
Yeah. Interesting. I had another mentor over time who used to use the analogy of kind of like you're playing a game in your life, your role of like, you're given a set of rules that define success. And so your job is actually to understand what were the rules that define someone's success at their previous company. And were they or weren't they successful first as a metric? And now if you can teach them a bit of the rules that would make you successful in our organization.
Interesting.
Do you have the capabilities to become successful or to learn how to play by different worlds? I've found that sometimes even like your former military, there is a reality that sometimes stepping outside of your role in the military could be perceived as insubordination or would like not be welcome. Whereas some of the organizations, like you being hard charging and like stepping outside of your role looks like you taking personal like interest and like hunger. And so it's one of those where you could have a false assumption that like you just didn't have the motivation, as opposed to truly understanding you were successful within your confines. And if I taught you that it was acceptable for you to just do anything you thought was right here, would you take the opportunity? But we can't expect you to retrain yourself on that. We have a responsibility to teach you the rules of success at our organization. So I've always found that helpful of forcing myself to define, were they excellent in their context? What is different about our context?
I like it.
And have I given them the opportunity to understand our context?
I love that because I do really think, even outside of just hiring, bigger picture, so many organizations, if you think about culturally,
Mm.
do such a poor job of really defining what is appropriate, how to
Mm.
act, what the rules of the game are. They're
Yeah.
really bad at defining what the rules of the game are.
Yeah.
And often in that environment, the people who succeed are the ones who are really good at understanding the rules or figuring out the rules. And that weeds out a lot of people
Hmm.
who could otherwise be successful if you just told them that ahead of time.
Hmm.
And certainly, again, it always comes back to what you're trying to build, what culture you want, but chances are figuring out the rules doesn't need to be the thing.
Yeah.
You know,
It's one of the interesting things that I've seen in like live conversations around GPAs
Mhm.
for like recent college graduates
Sure.
is sometimes there's
Great
been
example.
a movement
Great example.
away from 4.0 students
Interesting.
because there's a perception that those students like learned what the rules were able to
Yes.
perform to the rules.
Yes.
And so in an environment like K2 where we're actively defining who we are and taking big swings,
yeah.
we can't always give you the level of specificity. We need someone who can hang with a level of ambiguity and create forward momentum
Yeah.
even through ambiguity.
Yeah.
And so there's sometimes a perception, or at least I often make myself ask the question of someone who's really highly performed in that way of like, where have you had to
Yeah.
define for yourself or like understand those things? How have you
Yeah.
faced ambiguity?
Yeah.
I think it's that same thing of there are places where you have to test, can someone survive without being given the rules?
Yeah.
Because that is a reality of our environment.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's the reality of our generation that we've
Yeah.
found is, we grew up just being like, if you follow the rules, if you do this thing, you're going to check these
It'll work
boxes
out.
and it's going to work out. And because that worked for the last
Mhm.
couple decades. But even not just in space and aerospace, but more broadly, just like every industry these days
Disruption.
it's all about disruption. And so if you can follow the rules, cool, but like we don't know what the rules are yet.
Yeah.
So we need to figure
No
it
one's
out.
going to write it. Yeah.
Yeah,
You have to be
awesome.
part of it.
That's really interesting. Yeah, but I think the takeaway that I would have for the two biggest takeaways that I'm hearing from this conversation
Yeah.
for hiring managers are one, that it is a relationship, that it's about this give and pull of there's things that the hiring manager are bringing, there's things that the recruiter are bringing, and it's all about figuring out how to mix together to be
Mhm.
successful. And then after that, it's the importance of as you're working together is really defining what the role is, what success looks like, and that is kind of the guiding light for everything else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think the thing that came to mind as you were talking through it is also don't be afraid of inviting your recruiter into your things. Of like almost
Oh.
imagining them as an extension of your team.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly like
Yeah.
a recruiter can't come to everything potentially.
Sure. Yeah.
But I know it was always meaningful to start getting the weekly updates from that team, to even start piecing together
Yeah.
the jargon or the projects or
Yeah.
like enticing things that you might take for granted
Yeah.
as part of the hiring team,
Yeah.
but might be helping to build the awareness for me. Or
Yeah.
like inviting that person to your team meetings to get to know the team.
Yeah.
I think most recruiters that I work with are deeply motivated by the
Mhm.
interpersonal relationships.
Mhm.
And so feeling connected to the team is going to be what pushes them through like the late night slog or like, man, I really want to get this done for Matt, as opposed to like, I really want to get this done.
Yeah.
So I think don't be afraid of taking that like relationship beyond just the relationship of the partnership of executing the role, but
Yeah.
truly like you're a critical member of my
Yeah.
team to
Yeah.
continue staffing this.
Yeah.
And you should feel like a member of my team.
I love it. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for taking the
Absolutely.
time out. I'm sure you're super busy building K2. If people want to find out more about K2, like where should they?
Yeah,
What are you-
k2space.com.
Okay.
We're pretty embarrassingly easy to find.
Excellent.
But yeah, big things coming.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jesse. It's been a pleasure reconnecting.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you so much for listening to today's show. If you are looking for help turning your organization's great engineers into great managers, me and my team at Better Everyday Studios would love to help. We deliver targeted and interactive training workshops that are designed to help build the 3 fundamental skills of any new manager: building trust, giving feedback, and setting goals. Reach out to me through matt@bettereverydaystudios.com so we can start making your organization better every day.